Welcome to Soul Trek. This episode, Food, Faith, Fellowship. In Matthew's Gospel, there's a really interesting story. It's the fourth chapter, verses 1 to 11. It's the story of the temptation in the wilderness of Jesus Christ. And I think it's really important for us to analyze these temptations because I think they tell us something that's really, really significant. And that is that Jesus really wants these things. So I think when you look at stones into bread, that's really about food, and not just the food that a hungry person might want. I mean, somebody who's been fasting for 40 days. But it's also about all of us and the food, the shelter, the clothing, the physical needs that all of us want. Those are things that Jesus really wants. The second one has to do with Jesus being taken to the pinnacle of the temple. And in a very real way, that's about faith. And that's another thing that Jesus really, really wants, is for people to come into a relationship with God, to have faith in God. And the final of the temptations is that Jesus is shown all of the kingdoms of the world. In other words, all of the ways that we organize ourselves in community and the fellowship that's associated with that. So all of these temptations, and I think that a temptation isn't really a temptation unless it really tempts us. And so I think Jesus is really tempted by the idea of food for everyone, people coming to God in faith, and people experiencing that fellowship of healthy community. These are all things that Jesus really wants, but of course, not on the devil's terms or on Satan's terms or whatever. He wants people to achieve those things on God's terms. And one of the chief elements of that, I think, is freedom. We've been given the freedom to accept that invitation, to be in relationship with God, or to reject it. We are free to be friends with God. We are free to not be friends with God. And that's what genuine friendship is. To be genuine, we need to be free to make that choice. And so God has given us that freedom. And it's necessary, I think, as well, for creation, therefore, to be somewhat random, that there is indeed suffering and death in the world, and yet still this invitation is issued to us to be in relationship, to be friends with God, to have that unforced, genuine, free relationship with God, regardless of the circumstances of our life, regardless of the things, the trials and tribulations that we face, but also the joys that we experience. The Brandenburg Concertos, Elvis Presley's blue suede shoes, chocolate chip cookies, whatever it might be. Those are the things those are the joys that we can experience in life as well. And being in loving relationships with God and being in loving relationships with one another. And loving relationships involve a sense of suffering as well. I have loved people who have died. I have loved people who have died far too young. And yet I wouldn't trade that love for never having known that person as well. So we live in a random world, a world where there's suffering and pain. And in the midst of all of that, suffering and pain, and I also say joys as well, that in the midst of all that, God calls us into relationship. God calls us into friendship. And that friendship is unforced, genuine, and free. There's no threats of hell or anything like that as far as I'm concerned. It's just a genuine invitation that God desires us and wants to be in relationship with us and is willing to sacrifice on our behalf as well. And that's why he sends his Son into the world. That's why Jesus is here. That's why the incarnation happens. And for God, it's all worth it. His life, his teachings and healings, but also his passion, his arrest, his torture, his crucifixion, and his resurrection. It's all worth it to be a real invitation to us to be in relationship with God, to be friends with God in this world, and to work together to achieve the things that we need to ensure that people have food and shelter and clothing, to be sure that people have an opportunity to worship freely, to have faith, and also to be in fellowship with one another, to be in healthy communities where we do indeed support one another. This is God's desire. This is at the heart of the friendship that God offers us and the hope that God has, that we are willing to enter into that relationship unforced, genuine, and free. That's our soul's trick. Thank you.